One thing that comes to mind here is, I don't know if you've ever read Dalio's book, Principles.
Mm-hmm.
He goes through this scenario where he basically structured an options strategy, I guess, for McDonald's, to where it enabled them to have the chicken McNugget for sort of a similar reason. The prices of chicken were fluctuating too much. So they went in and put a collar around this thing so they could get predictable long-term chicken pricing, which led to the production of the chicken nugget, which is sort of what you're saying here in this competitive environment of fiat currencies, that a sovereign or an issuer would then put these parameters in place. I guess it'd be a soft guarantee on purchasing power, right? Like this,
yeah, it's soft because, of course, in a true shortage, that price is going to run away from you. You just have to let it go, right?
Yeah.
But that's actually something which is a reasonable product to offer.
Mm-hmm. So I agree with all of this. I guess the issue would be you're still having to trust the issuer. Like if they're giving you this long-term predictable inflation.
Yes, but that's portfolio theory, because you wouldn't put 100% of your trust where you put
exactly.
0.
Yes, right. That makes sense. So in this type of future, you end up, I mean, I guess as a sovereign individual, you're holding most of your reserve in Bitcoin. And then if you're operating in a particular jurisdiction for a particular amount of time, you're funding that fiat currency to go in and live or do business or whatever it may be.
That's right. Or in a truly internationally competitive environment, see, what I don't think most people have taken on board is the true implication of what a digital wallet means. Because I think the DeFi matrix is going to be, to this decade, what the social graph was to the last. And what I mean by that is every asset, let me kind of give an analogy with Google News. Google News, if you remember when it came out in the early 2000s, it put every newspaper in competition with every other newspaper.
Right.
Suddenly, the Arkansas Gazette, this, and the Miami Herald, and the Chicago Tribune or whatever, it was all shown that they were just reprinting the same AP story.
Yeah, right.
Right. And suddenly it was something where, wait a second, there's no value add for that anymore. As more and more people go online, there was value add if you're distributing this physically in Chicago, the other guys distributing in Miami. Making photocopies was valuable back when the internet didn't exist. Mm-hmm. But when the guy in Chicago and Miami and New York and Colorado could all just click and view the same thing, the value of those trucks and distribution networks and the photocopies they're making, that went away, right? Yep. And and then that led to the basically destruction of traditional local newspapers and traditional media, and winner-take-all competition, and the ascendance of these international outlets and clickbait and the ideological meltdown, and now Substack. That unlocked a bunch of things, right?
Yeah.
We are just at the beginning of the same thing for every asset. Because the search engines, like the exchanges of today, are going to become asset search engines tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where every asset is going on chain. It's not just digital gold. It is every for example, in the US, we have this sort of, in my view, very archaic discussion about 1930s statutes and orange groves as what is security versus what is not. And to be clear, whatever the letter of the law is, you abide by that, okay? But it's extremely stupid to say, oh, this is a security, therefore it's bad or whatever. This stuff is 100 years old.
Right.
Like we have to revisit this in 2021.
Yes.
You can't tell, right? I mean, just as somebody, I mean, you actually have like an accounting background, like a finance background.
I do, yeah. I was a CPA. For a while.
Okay.
Yeah. And to your point, these laws were they did not contemplate digital reality at all.
Exactly. I mean, like if you've ever done an M&A or a VC investment or something like that, the effort required to to maintain every month your chart of accounts and your general ledger, and from that prepare your financial statements, your balance sheet, your income statement, cash flow, and then all of the things that come out of that, because you have like operationally useful versions of that where you're breaking it out by this subgroup and that's a discretionary expense.
Yeah, region, yeah.
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah. And then you go up one higher order, which is, will the VC invest or will this company buy you? And that's based not on just your balance sheet today, but it's like the history of it over time. Mm-hmm. All of that stuff should be auto-generated. All of that's like right now, that is this huge manual process. And you have things like, GAAP versus the
IFRS.
international. Yeah, that's right. IFRS. Yeah. And often those differences boil down to parameter choices. Like, do you do FIFO or LIFO for inventory is like one of the big differences between them, right?
Yeah.
All of that should be code. Yes. And once you have transactions on chain, you have financial statements on chain. Once you have financial statements on chain, you start having companies on chain. Once you have companies on chain, you have M&A on chain. Okay. Yeah. And so my point is, and of course you have equity on chain, right? And so just from a pure efficiency standpoint, for the same reason that we're sending emails rather than physical mails, for the same reason that we will do video chat rather than flying out, or that we will use a search engine rather than going to a library. Digital finance will digitize every aspect of the corporation and also reduce the costs of selling a company, buying a company, all these things. You know, FLIPPA, do you know what that is?
I do not.
It's unfortunately named, but it's called FLIPPA, where it's like flipping small businesses or whatever. I hate the name because it's like, like I don't think of capitalism as about flipping things. Okay. Yeah. But I do think the idea of a market for small businesses is a good thing. Like that liquidity is good, right?
Yeah.
So what's my point? The DeFi matrix, the reason I call it the DeFi matrix is one square of the DeFi matrix is like Bitcoin versus, or rather one rectangle is Bitcoin versus all the fiat currencies of the world, right? Bitcoin versus USD, Bitcoin versus EUR, Bitcoin versus RUB, et cetera. Okay. Then you have all the crypto, that's a whole square, right? Bitcoin versus Ethereum, Bitcoin versus, this and that currency in this square, right? Then you have fiat, which is the Forex market. Then you have fiat versus equity, which is USD versus Google stock, USD versus Facebook stock, and so on, right? And then once you start filling this in, you've got commodities, right? You've got all these other digital assets, whatever. When you fill this in, it's something where when you truly take on board what a digital wallet means every kind of asset, mortgages, stocks, fiat currencies, Bitcoin, NFTs, whatever. All of those are in one gigantic digital wallet with like a billion rows. And then the billion versus billion is the DeFi matrix. Now, what are the implications for countries? Well, there's lots of implications for lots of different parties, but it's very similar to what Google News did. It just puts everybody into competition with everybody else.
Right.
Okay. Like, just like the Miami Herald and the Chicago Tribune were suddenly competing with each other for clicks. The Swiss franc and the Chinese RMB are suddenly competing with each other for portfolio holders.
Yes.
And new entrants to the market like Estonia or Israel or smaller countries can issue fiat currencies that can scale to the whole world if they can be deployed in the right digital wallet.
Right. And all this competition is inducing more honesty between issuers too, right? They're going to,
right.
You would want to inflate less to attract more currency holders.
That's right. Yeah. I think Bitcoin becomes the 0 of this thing. It's like the single most important square.
Zero. I love the analogy.
That's right. It is. It's literally what the whole thing is, right? Yeah. Like in a matrix algebra, you'll denote like the first element, either 1, 1 or 0, 0.
Zero because it's 0% terminal inflation, and it's perfected what we want in money.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of reasons, but it's essentially the asset that everybody wants.
Yes. Right.
So because it's that universal thing, it is the denominator of the DeFi matrix. And I mean, the thing is when people talk about gold, right? And they say, oh, Bitcoin would be successful if it was on par with gold. It's close, by the way. It's like 2 trillion gold, like 1 trillion Bitcoin. It's close now, right? That's actually an underestimate. And the reason is gold in the 2010s and the early 2020s is a neutered version of its former self. It's a gelded version, because gold, if you go and read history books, gold used to be what it was all about.
Oh, yeah.
Right. You're actually probably more expert than almost anybody, probably including myself on this. But the Spanish, they were all about the gold they brought from the New World that flooded the market and, rose prices because it kind of violated the assumption of gold scarcity. But gold was the center of that old economy.
Yes.
And if digital gold is the center of this new economy, it's not $1 trillion. It's like $100 trillion or something insane like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed completely. No, I do a deep study of the history of gold. I just finished a book actually called The Twilight of Gold. I don't know if you've read this one, but yeah, to your point, it is the game, right? The game was gold. How do you accumulate as much gold as possible? And it had this really interesting effect that the author actually referred to gold as the regulator of governments. It
Yes,
induced
exactly.
discipline in the balance of payments, which is to say the capital inflows and outflows of a country. If a country's being monetarily irresponsible, gold would leave the country. So it had this checking mechanism on government. And I tweeted out something I thought was kind of witty the other day. I said, Bitcoin will become the ungovernable governor of government.
Did you see so I love that. I did a tweet on this a couple of years ago, and I gave a podcast on it with similar ideas, where I was like, Bitcoin at, $10,000 is an industry. Bitcoin at $100,000 is a government. Bitcoin at $1 million is a global government, just a pro-freedom global government, and one that neither party anticipated. So the reason I say it's kind of like, the Hegelian dialectic thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? Yeah. So thesis were these various folks who have wanted for many years, like the UN to become a global government, the supranational entity, et cetera. Antithesis were folks who argued, I think with some reason, that, hey, that'd be terribly bad. We wouldn't have choice, that's oppressive and so on. And the synthesis is Bitcoin as the global government, but it's a pro-freedom global government in the sense that it constrains every state, since they can't print more Bitcoins, they can't seize and whatnot.
Right. So
it is kind of a head explode combination of these two things, right? And this, by the way, it's funny, like, Peter Schiff, who I know he's like a anti-Bitcoin troll in some ways on Twitter. And I think it's all like, it's kind of fake because his son will kind of troll him back or whatever now. And so they're both like kind of gaining followers.
It's great for engagement. Yeah. Yeah.
It's great. It's great for engagement. It's clearly like some Tom and Hardy kind of thing or whatever. Right. But the thing is that I think the fundamental thing that Peter Schiff and the other gold guys don't get is gold is gelded. We already know it has been because FDR defeated it. And we don't know if the state can defeat Bitcoin. That is still uncertain.
Right.
And that is actually the fact that China swung hard at it with what it did with the mining is one of the most important proof points yet. The fact that it only knocked down mining by like 60%, and then mining recovered, went from 180 exahashes to 80. Certainly is pretty unfortunate for those Chinese miners. I feel bad for them.
Yeah.
The lawless sort of, CCP kind of just U-turn. They did all this compliance stuff and then just bankrupted and crushed on this. I do feel bad for them.
Yeah.
But
good for Bitcoin.
Bitcoin holders unaffected, pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like slower transactions for a little while. But the thing about that is, China's an extremely well organized, as I said, like lawful evil in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. They're an extremely well organized and competent state that was ahead of the curve, on so many things. And if they took this hard swing at it, because they don't F around when they're doing something, if they took a hard swing at it and they couldn't stop it, there's no other country that has the scale, the alignment, the speed, the ruthlessness that they do. So at least the mining attack, I think, is probably off the table for now, modulo like some escalation, which like starts treating it like war on terror or something like that, which is not impossible, by the way, but even then, I think that's unlikely because El Salvador and others are state sponsors of Bitcoin, so to speak, right?
Yes.
So you'll get polarization, and you also crucially will not have unity within the US or other countries for prosecuting such a war, because there's, it's not like terrorism. It's something which benefits people, right?
Yeah.
So as much as the state might want to do it, they have too many people domestically. They don't have the consent to push that through, as we kind of saw with the pushback against this recent infrastructure, quote unquote, bill that was going after Bitcoin, going after crypto.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And I would add to the tailwinds for Bitcoin in this respect is I think its value proposition is simple enough that it's going to penetrate a lot of minds relatively quickly. I know it's hard to understand at a distance, but once you start to get it, it's like money that can't steal from you or be stolen from you. Like people are going to figure that out. But I like this actually analogy of Bitcoin as a world government, because like government, its core value proposition really is, I guess you could say, securing property rights, or even providing property in a way. That's sort of the whole purpose of government, right? It's supposed to be the security network that lets the market do its thing. And then you know that however you expend your time and energy, you can claim those fruits of labor. Like Bitcoin gives you something similar.
There's something people used to say or still say, which I think is wrong, but in the case of Bitcoin, it's right. They would say, oh, the Chinese aren't like us. They make plans for 100 years or something like that. And I'd always laugh at that. I'm like, have you seen the last 100 years in China? There's a civil war. There's Maoism. Like, they're human beings like everybody else. They make mistakes and they have huge F-ups, right? They're definitely not doing any 100-year plans, okay?
Yes.
But with Bitcoin, maybe you can. At least you can. It is one of the most certain things that you can plan around now. And the whole Lindy argument that it's funny. Like, Taleb was pro Bitcoin and now he's against it because of some emotional thing. I like Taleb. I'm not fighting with Taleb. If you're listening, I'm not fighting with you, but I disagree with you on this premise. Okay, but Taleb's concept of Lindy, I think, is. It's not his concept, of course. It's something he's popularized, though,
right? Of
something that has existed for some time. Therefore, you should believe it's going to exist for longer. There's something to that, okay? But it's also not true because there's 1,000 things I can point to. I mean, we had
it's a life expectancy thing, not a guarantee.
Yeah, it's not a guarantee. We had horses for how many centuries, and then we had cars. Yes. Like, technology is about the fact that, yes, sometimes this time is different. By the way, just as a side note on that, on the East Coast, there's commonly people will say in this sort of sardonic way, "Oh, this time it's different, huh?" Mm-hmm. And it's meant to be a knockdown of, well, clearly you're naive. Of course, it's not different. And it really, to me, captures this East Coast mentality where they're mindlessly repeating a saying that applies in a specific context, but not a general context. The opposite of this time, or the equivalent of this time it's never different is things never change. And that's clearly not true. Right. Sometimes it is different, right? And it comes, I believe, from like a situation where there was some like fraudulent fund or something like that. And then it was extrapolated out into this general cynicism and conservatism about the possibility of change. And I don't think that's the case. And that's where I think the Lindy kind of thing can take one wrong, where it makes people very conservative in a small c sense, where they're simply just not wise enough to be heads up and looking for possible disruptors. The opposite of Lindy is, only the paranoid survive.
Yeah. Interesting.
Right. Andy Grove, CEO of Intel, he was like, we've been killing it for a while, but the Japanese are coming up with DRAM and we need to pivot out of that. Only the paranoid survive is the opposite of just being very contented. And so, this is actually similar to the whole fox and hedgehog thing, which is itself a mental model. Do you just have one thing that you just like thump and use on every issue? Or do you have this mental model for this thing and this mental model for that thing? And I think the second is a more robust way of doing it. You do have general principles, but there are exceptions and edge cases and times where one model applies and the other one doesn't. Let me pause there.
Yeah, well, and it's the trick or the art, I guess, is knowing how to zoom in and zoom out based on circumstances. So it seems, again, I like the analogy of Bitcoin as a government because it's enforcing or granting property rights, granted one specific property right, just in money, not in other tangible forms of property. But it's, as an institution, it appears to be largely immune to politics, which is really important.
Okay, go ahead. I will somewhat disagree with you on that, but then
that's fine. And then the one thing that, what I just mentioned, the other property rights, I think about this a lot, actually. You've said we're going to end up on this, I think you called it the DeFi matrix, which is kind of like all property globally digitized in a single, accessible via a single wallet, something like that.
Eventually, yeah, exactly. It gets to a single digital wallet. Yeah.
The eventually is where my thinking gets stuck, because it seems to me like the state is going to really hold on to the ledger, right? The property ledger, that they say who owns what property. You clear equity and real estate transactions through the state, title, and all these things. It seems like that's not something they're going to relinquish willingly. So my general thought pattern on that was that Bitcoin needed to do its thing for a while first, really become kind of defund the nation state to some extent before these functions of other property started to fall off of the state, of state control, let's say.
Yeah. So more control can mean less upside. The reason I say can is it is possible to be a competent, centrally planned state. East Asian countries are probably the best example of this. The Meiji Restoration is maybe the canonical, which is how Japan modernized in the mid 1800s. They were shocked by, how advanced the Westerners were, and they're just basically put in a crash program. They did have international exchange. They had academics go abroad and so on, but they basically just like modernized the country. So the reason I say more control can mean less upside is certainly the Soviet system showed that. Communist systems have showed that. France has shown that. It's driven away. It's coined, the term entrepreneur comes from France, but many of its entrepreneurs have come away. Macron is kind of reversing that a little bit, but basically it is something that they have done. And so that would be the check on what you're saying, which is a restricted digital wallet. I agree is something that countries will try to do, but the unrestricted wallet will, for the same reason that American and European options have different prices, the unrestricted one has a higher price. And so the question is, will the extra stability that they get via that control be worth the upside that you get from allowing more volatility? And that really is, a huge part of centralization versus decentralization this decade is centralization is stability, and stability bounds downside, but it also bounds upside.
Yeah.
And so you're going to see the best fight against centralization and the middle push for it. And, or not always, because some of the best will pull. It's one of these interesting things where the guy at the 50% mark doesn't benefit from a decentralized world, but the people at the extremes do.
Yes.
And, let me actually drill into that a little bit just to talk about that. Like, what is crypto for? What is Bitcoin specifically and crypto more generally for? It's for the power user and the marginalized. Mm-hmm. It's extremes of the distribution, right? So the power user is the developer or the investor who wants to move millions of dollars around the world with a keystroke to invest in something or to, be the backhaul for like Airbnb, some like giant tech companies moving billions of dollars, millions of dollars around the world with a keystroke. They don't have to deal with thousands of wire transfers and all this stupid stuff. It's just boop, 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 boop. It just moves around. You're the power user of money. Okay. Mm-hmm. On the other extreme, you're the marginalized and you're just trying to hold on to a bank account. You're in Nigeria, you're in, like Venezuela, you're in some country where they're cracking down and you just want the most basic financial services. And so then you want Bitcoin, you want crypto, you want to protect your funds, and then you want checking and other kinds of things. You want those financial services on top of it. And this is the opposite of the stable person in a middle class environment. However, and that like Starbucks guy. And that's why like the whole coffee thing, that's not actually where Bitcoin was 10x, because the coffee transaction, it's not very large, very small, very fast, very international, very automated, or very transparent. It's something that is medium size and medium amount of time that it takes, and it's manual. You can see the other person, and it doesn't need to be posted on some public chain for people to be able to diligence that you did. It only matters between you and them, and so on and so forth. So that like middle-class transaction is exactly the opposite of what this enables. However, that middle-class person is, on the one hand, becoming a power user because they're getting onto Robinhood, they're getting onto Coinbase, they're trading stocks. There's hundreds of millions of people. There's at least 100 million people doing this when there were 300,000 people on Bloomberg terminals in the 90s. So that's like on the order of 100 to 1,000x increase. So you're becoming power users. You're becoming somebody who's on search engines. You're processing all this information. Only heads of state used to read like 5 newspapers a day in the 80s or the 90s. Now you read like 50. Okay, so everybody's becoming a power user of information and money, but they're also becoming marginalized users of information and money because they're being deplatformed and they're being unbanked and they're being, censored. And so the problems that Bitcoin and crypto solve that were not relevant to this guy living a stable middle-class existence are becoming relevant because they're transforming into both the power user and the marginalized at the same time. And actually, a good example of somebody who's both is somebody like Binance. who, is both an extreme, I have a lot of respect for CZ and what they've built. And so it's very hard as an entrepreneur to build something like that. It's challenging, but at the same time, they have to deal with all these governments and so on this end. So they're being pushed off of rails and whatnot. And so they're both at the same time, the power user and the marginalized. And I think in some ways, to get around being marginalized, you're going to have to become a power user. This brings us back to our original point of, becoming sovereign.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services, or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. Well, let me just introduce this, which was to I think the last point you were going off of. So there's kind of these two, this is something I've thought about separately, but seems to align with something you just said, which is there's these two poles of Bitcoin adoption. And at one end, you have kind of the billionaire or high net worth individual class that I think will adopt Bitcoin as a means of escaping forced wealth redistribution. We saw AOC the other day with the dress, tax the rich, that was making the rounds. Like every time we get into government insolvency, forced wealth redistribution, tax the rich, these ideas become really aggressively implemented. And I think Bitcoin will just be adopted in that strata as the one untouchable asset in a lot of ways. And at the other end of the spectrum, or the other end of the pole, you see the common citizen just trying to escape hyperinflation. So the opposite end of the billionaires is someone trying to, make ends meet, or escape a predatory monetary regime. Do you think so based on what you said earlier, nation state adoption of Bitcoin and or the digitization of property rights could be similar, or you think it will occur at the extremes and then kind of work its way inward?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense of, I think so you have countries like El Salvador now, but also I think Tuvalu is flirting with it. There's an Eastern European country, I think the Bitfury guys, George Kikvzadeh, is kind of writing about Ukraine having a bill on this. And there will be countries that are sort of neglected by the global financial system that will adopt Bitcoin because, you know what, they're at zero already. They're ignored by the world. They're not that wealthy. Roll the dice, take a risk. If they've got good leaders who are capable of taking calculated risks, then maybe they'll get somewhere. So that's kind of on the marginalized end. And the power user end, you have folks with large stakes who will go and talk to, like the hedge fund folks who've come out, the Dalios and Paul Tudor Jones and Saylor, and and certainly, I mean, us in Tech VC, I think we're some of the very earliest adopters on this. Nothing against the more recent, finance folks who've gone into it, but Tech VC was probably the very earliest large holders of BTC, and especially on a personal level, many of the angels in Silicon Valley have large BTC holdings. And make the case that this is innovation, and make the case, which is true, that it's a financial innovation, that it is something that the state should not ban for the same reason that it doesn't ban gold, the American state did, but other cultures, for example, in India, have had a very long relationship with gold, and for the same reason that you have limited government, that the government, the government embraces, at least in theory, the concept of limiting itself. you actually want something like this, which is not destabilizing, but it is a limit on what the state can do. And it is a frictional thing that you introduce on purpose to prevent the abuse of human rights. So that's the sense, basically, in which I think it also has the marginalized and the power users kind of legalizing this worldwide. And that's kind of what's been happening.
Gotcha. Okay. And then property rights, similarly, you think those that adopt, say El Salvador is adopting Bitcoin today, they'll be more likely to digitize other property rights in the coming decades just by virtue of their involvement with Bitcoin?
Yeah. And, the thing about this, by the way, it's like, it's difficult to talk about this without, saying things that the maximalists disagree with. But
no problems here.
I think, yes. So the thing is that, Satoshi Nakamoto was not a maximalist. I don't know if you've seen some of the things that I've quoted or whatever from him, but he's talking about name coins with Hal Finney, and he's talking about multiple digital currencies, and it was something where it was not like a taboo topic or made into something. That was a very late arrival to the whole space. For those people who were in it early, it was not thought of as like this taboo thing to talk about other currencies. In many ways, I analogize it to monotheism or monostatism, where it's something where only one God, and I just don't think that's the case. Like anybody who's, even if you're extremely bullish on gold, and I am, and I'm bullish on digital gold, there's other assets besides gold. Like it's kind of like, there's folks who think the government can do everything, and they project like godlike capabilities onto it because they don't have a god. So do you remember this video from like 10 years ago, government is the thing we all belong to?
No, I've never seen that.
Okay. So if you Google this, government is the thing we all belong to. For people who are, communityless and bereft of everything, the state is the thing we all belong to. So they sort of project the old bearded guy onto the state. It's the most powerful thing. And if you're against the government, they take it not as, oh, you think this is not the right tool for the job, but as a personal attack on their sense of self and on their de facto religion of kind of state worship. Okay.
Yes.
And this is more explicit actually in the case of China, where it really is like a form of state worship, where they have the symbol of the state, the hammer and sickle everywhere. And that's literally something that they would paste above a cross. That's what they did in the Soviet Union. They put the state above God in that sense, right? Yeah. So that's GOV over GOD. Like God, GOV can do everything, anything. And that's actually the opposite of limited government. That's unlimited government.
Right.
That is like go ahead.
No, I agree with you. It's just the pathway to, atrocity and tyranny too.
It's a pathway to atrocity. Now, the thing is, I don't think we're anywhere near at atrocity and tyranny, but I think there's an irrational aspect. Bitcoin fixes this was a joke, for a long time. And it's still a joke, and it's still in good humor, and I'm not against it or whatever. But like, it can't, it's when I say it can't fix everything, what I mean by that is it may be really important and maybe the single most important factor for the world in the future, but we're still going to need to eat. We're still going to have tomato futures, and we're still going to have companies, and we're still going to have other financial instruments, and so on and so forth. And so today, like the world of quote Bitcoin versus shitcoin or whatever is its own little subculture, here. But tomorrow, every single technology, every open source project, every legacy company, and every future entity will be on chain and will have a token. And now this actually maps back to the DeFi matrix, because in this environment where you have literally millions of choices, billions of choices, the simplest thing you can do, and it's a very adaptive strategy, is say, screw all that, just hold Bitcoin. Okay. And you know what? There's a lot to be said for that. There's a simplicity of it. There's like, I don't have time to evaluate all this stuff. I don't have any energy for it. I don't know what's a fraud or a scam or whatever. I'll just hold this one thing. And you know what? There's something to be said for that. There's a simplicity of that. I get that. However, it's sort of the same eventually as holding Vanguard. And the reason I say that is today we're in the disequilibrium state where Bitcoin is romping to world dominance. And it probably has at least another 10x, maybe 100x in front of it. once it gets, first of all, just 10 or 100x is amazing for most investments. It's particularly amazing for large amounts of money because it's very hard, as you know, as an investor. It's one thing to invest $100,000 in something. You might be able to get 1,000 or 10,000x. You know, Peter Thiel, I think, got like 5,000x or something out of the Facebook investment. And as an angel investor, one can, and you can do better than that, right? Because you're investing at a very early stage and there's value creation. But you can do that on $1,000 or $10,000 or even $100,000. It gets harder and harder to have that level of multiplier the larger the amount of money. At $1 million or 10 million or 100 million, especially $1 billion, it's really hard to find 10x's at $1 billion. And so Bitcoin has like a safe 10x for $1 billion or 10 billion is like unprecedented, you know. Right. And so if you've got a large fund, of course, you should put the maximum amount you can into BTC. Okay. Something that's a 20% limit or something like that. This is not financial advice, blah, 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 you know, but like what I mean by that is if I was running a fund.
Assuming you share the worldview that you and I have.
Assuming you share the worldview that you and I have, right? Okay. But given all of that, the thing is that, you know, even if something is doing 10 to 100x over a decade, you put $1 billion in it, and that's going to be a pretty good decision. And you're not going to probably regret that. But for the same reason that Vanguard isn't the only instrument out there, there's people who will always try to beat the market. And if you attack that too hard, you actually become so ultra conservative that you're against any kind of innovation. Everything new is haram. Everything new is suspect. Everything new is a scam. Everything new is a fraud. Everything new, you're a shill or a charlatan because you set up a new cap table. Guess what? You know, when you set up a company and the founder has 100% of the shares, they pre-mine the shares.
It's very centralized.
It's very centralized, right? But guess what? You know, companies are good overall. I mean, that's how we eat food. That's grocery stores and that's automobiles. And, you know, I mean, do I have to make this point? It's like super obvious for any like capitalist, you know, but the thing is today there's like a hard division between the paper equity of a cap table and the digital equity that's on chain, because in the US, everybody's had to bend themselves into pretzels due to all the stupid stuff around securities laws and whatnot that are, you know, 100 years old. And again, I think these laws are stupid, but you abide by them because people have a gun to your head. Don't get me wrong. Okay. However, you also seek to change them and recognize that you do want a cap table on chain for the same reason that Carta outcompetes Excel, outcompetes a piece of paper.
Yes.
You know, of course it's better. Of course you want it on chain. You want guarantees. You want to have digital signatures rather than simple board votes. Like this is just obvious stuff.
Social scalability and Szabo's.
It's social scalability. And it's also something where, I mean, the pragmatic people, there's very few people relatively as a percentage who have actually mined Bitcoin. Most people have bought it off exchanges. And those exchanges are disproportionately run by people who are practical enough to make the trade-off to add fiat currency, which was very controversial, by the way, back in the day. I don't know if you remember this, but you know, Bitcoin is supposed to be so anti-bank. Oh my God, I can't believe you're doing password reset. Oh my God, I can't believe you're allowing us to buy, you know, BTC for USD. If those pragmatic trade-offs had not been made by practical people who were pro-Bitcoin but also efficient, you don't even have the ecosystem today.
Yes.
Right. And so this is something where, you know, the definition, in my view, of what does it mean to be pro-Bitcoin, the more Bitcoin you have, the more pro-Bitcoin you are. Everything else is noise. The definition of pro-Bitcoin, the more Bitcoin you hold for the long term, the more pro-Bitcoin you are. Everything else is just talk. And it can be faked. And it is being faked. And it will be faked. It'll be faked by people who are basically like maximalists. Maximize the number of likes they have on Twitter, not the amount of Bitcoin they have. Maximize the amount of Bitcoin you have, maximizing the legality of it means making pragmatic decisions to legalize it and so on. In fact, even this El Salvador decision, for example, is in a sense a compromise in a different way. It's actually a deep philosophical issue. The concept of mandatory Bitcoin is a big deal for all the voluntarist principles that we're talking about, right? Now, do I think that you can get to an end state where you say it is the lesser of two evils, that that we already have currency mandates in place, and that the El Salvador bill is better than, existing currency mandates. Yeah, I think you can make that argument, but I think we should have that argument. I think we should have that discussion, because that's it. The whole point of this was voluntarism and choice and freedom and whatnot. And mandatory Bitcoin is similar to buy Bitcoin with fiat. It is a compromise. It is a practical trade-off, but we should recognize it as such. And so coming back at the stack, Nayib Bukele wants crypto exchanges in the country, wants investment development. Why? Because it's a poor country, and they can't afford a luxury ideology that is really kind of it's not even number go up. I think there's a distorted version of that, because it's not even the maximizing of wealth. I mean, where would the Bitcoin ecosystem be today if there were no fiat exchanges, and if nobody was buying Bitcoin for use in DeFi, and if the crypto community outside of Bitcoin didn't exist for lobbying the state to keep things like, I'm not arguing that there's not some competition at times. There's certainly, I think, dumb people who will say things like, oh, proof of work is environmentally bad, therefore we need to go proof of stake. I grant that exists. I also grant that scams exist. And I understand why people would want to just go Bitcoin only if they don't have the time or the energy to diligence something that's a scam from a non-scam. Where I differ, actually, I had this sort of thing that's a tweet that I'll send at some point. Let me see if I can find it. Exit the Fed, check. Stop the bailouts, check. Return to sound money, check. Build a voluntary society, check. End the welfare warfare state, check. Bitcoin as the global reserve currency, check. Bitcoin as an epochal technological breakthrough, check. Bitcoin as the only digital asset ever, everything else is evil, you lost me.
Go
ahead.
Well said. I just want to throw some things back your way, because I think you and we both, it's interesting. I hold 100% of my savings is in Bitcoin. I have held other positions in the past, especially when I was operating a fund. But I've found, for my own peace of mind, I'm just in an all Bitcoin position right now. And that's good with me. Doesn't mean I'll always be there, but that's where I am today. And it's funny, you have this I think you coined pro BTC, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I coined this thing, I think, freedom maximalism, where it's like, I didn't want to identify with this toxic culture that I don't identify with the cultural norms of. I didn't want to look at someone and tell them to have fun staying poor. So actually, and my thinking there is just that the principle, you can never confuse the principle for its implementation. So although Bitcoin is, or appears to be, the highest implementation of human reason or freedom we've ever had, if money is the ultimate tool for freedom, Bitcoin's the ultimate money, then Bitcoin's the ultimate tool for freedom. But that doesn't mean you put Bitcoin above freedom. All right. That's kind of like when the state puts itself above God in a way. You want to hold the principle highest.
Exactly. And the thing is, this is similar to, some people will beat up on centrism, because centrism can be done in a thoughtless way of just being a normie who just abides by everything, right? But there's a pragmatic form of centrism where, to start with the obvious statement, like, Nazism is bad, but so is wokeness. You like the extreme opposite of something doesn't necessarily get you to an optimum. You can have like a situation where white people are being sent to the back of the line for vaccines, as is happening in America in 2021, is bad, just as, what the Nazis did. It's like the exact opposite, the photographic negative. It's not necessarily that you want to, quote, maximize something and ram it to one extreme or another. The idea of balance is important. And so I'm sympathetic to freedom maximalism in the sense I think it's the right direction for us. But even freedom maximalism is something where as we were talking about earlier, there's certain things where if everybody is free, then a gang that cooperates can cooperate and kill all of you individually.
Market failures somewhere.
Exactly. There's market failures. There's things that are literally provided by collective entities. And one way of thinking about it is, it is true that the state is failing, but overcorrecting into crypto anarchy, while crypto anarchy is superior to San Francisco's state, it is not, in my view, optimal, right? And that's kind of, I would call it optimization rather than maximization. Mm-hmm. Okay, crypto anarchy is, the thing is, when we watch movies, even if they're dystopian, people end up reenacting them simply because it's a story we all know. Mm-hmm. And so you watch a dystopian thing like Mad Max, and that's actually a bad scenario. You don't want Mad Max. People take for granted that we live in a high trust-ish society where you don't have to test every like cup of coffee for whether there was poison in it. Right. Like in China, melamine was put into like kids' milk and like infants died. That's a terrible society to live in, where you have transaction costs and everything. Trust no one. A trustless society is actually a terrible thing. Mm-hmm. Conversely, to totally trust the existing state is likewise foolish. Mm-hmm. And so what is the answer is to rebuild trust, to uncouple from the current state and rebundle into entities, new nations effectively built online that have consent and mutual trust among the people. Mm-hmm. So it's like that third order. It is neither blindly trust the establishment nor become this like barbarian creature who trusts nobody. And that sounds cool today, by the way, but yeah. Actual Mad Max sucks. Yes. Right? It's one of these things where, a frequent state worshiper response to any critique of the state is go live in Somalia. Mm-hmm. But it is also true that that state in Somalia is not really a great place. You would neither want to live under the USSR, neither the Soviet Union nor Somalia. I think Singapore is better. I think Switzerland is better than both, right? Mm-hmm. Both the extreme of the total state and anarchy are obviously bad. I mean, these are like kind of 101 political theory concepts, but it's worth reiterating them because humans are sort of geared, especially in large, dumb mobs, to veer to one extreme or to another.
Right. Yes. Madness being the norm of crowds, I think was EJ said. So I agree. Right. And where I'm hung up, and I'm again admitting it's like, I haven't properly identified market failures in my mind. So maybe I'm still overcorrecting in my mental model towards decentralization, freedom, libertarianism. I do view Bitcoin as the only asset in my framework that has achieved true decentralization at this point. You and I are going to talk about this because you wrote an excellent piece on this in 2017 at some point, which is actually quantifying decentralization. So
let's talk about that.
You want to do that now? Okay.
Yeah, let's do that now. Yeah.
This one last point I want to make, and I'm constantly hashing this out in my own mind, so it feels good to say it out loud. I agree, Bitcoin doesn't fix everything, which is the common refrain among Bitcoin maximalists. However, I think its second and third and fourth order effects might, it's that foundational. It's something that imposes, we talked about financial discipline on governments, but it also imposes like hyper responsibility on all market actors. Like you gain this great power to be self-sovereign, but with that comes an equivalent level of responsibility. And I think that leveling up of responsibility could really make the canopies under which we organize ourselves much more effective and efficient, which might be these kind of networked states you're referring to, right? It's like a new organizational model that's based on a lot more information symmetry, I guess, where there's less predator and prey dynamics, much more social cohesion and such. And you did mention that, I just want to throw this out there if we get too far lost.
Sure.
You did mention you wanted to revisit the scenario of centralized East versus decentralized West, which might play into this.
Yes. So here's the thing is, absolutely. I think Bitcoin's second, third, and fourth order effects are very important. And again, relative to most people in the world, they would consider me a Bitcoin nutter who has been talking about Bitcoin for the better part of a decade, constantly to people. I mean, way before most people we were into this stuff and evangelizing it and whatnot, as I was mentioning. However, there's nothing so good that you can't overdo it.
Right.
Just nothing.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's true for religious fundamentalism. Like, do I think moderate religion is good? Yes. Do I think you can be a fundamentalist lunatic? Also true, right? Mm-hmm. Making money Is it important to make money, to create wealth and so on? Absolutely. Is that the sole and solitary purpose of one's life? No, you have, other things in life, right? So there's basically nothing so good that it can't be taken too far and to an extreme. And that's why I'm like, I'm just dispositionally not a maximalist. And that also actually, by the way, is sort of where I think a good chunk of the world is outside the West. The West is sort of, it has lots of great things, but it kind of generates both great good and great evil. Like communism came out of the West. Okay. This like insane ideology, wokeness has come out of the West. And it's like this, in the same way, like COVID came out of China and infected the rest of the world, like communism was exported from the West to China and to, Vietnam. These are places, this mind virus that messed them up badly, and so the West has some really great things. It has essentially the best and the very worst. And so like the ideological kind of lunacy is something which it is because people are logical / religious, that they think if A, then B, and if B, then C, and if C, then D, and if D, then E. And this is something Orwell talked about. He who believes X must believe Y. He who believes Y must believe Z. In the Soviet Union, it was applied as follows. Oh, you think the US is ahead of us? Well, that might mean you're a saboteur. Oh, you're a saboteur? Well, you're trying to wreck our great Soviet state, and therefore we need to bring you up for the death penalty. I mean, I don't even really exaggerate. That was actually the discourse at times. And you can also see this with the wokes on Twitter, where, like the equation that they're making of like math is white supremacist or something like that, which is
2 + 2 = 5. It's crazy.
Yeah, 2 + 2 = 5. Yeah, this stuff is. It is something where they start from I would argue, despite its tarnishing recently, a laudable premise of tolerance, but wokes are to tolerant liberals what, Nazis are to conservatives, or, what communists are to economic progressives, or in some ways what maximalists are to libertarians. Like it's something where you go so far out there that you invert the premises, and you essentially traduce what got you there, which is tolerance or voluntarism or conserving the past or helping the worker. Like, the economic progressive who may have genuinely wanted the best for workers in the Soviet Union, those workers were in gulags. They couldn't strike, And so you can go so far in a direction where you're voicing X, but then you start doing the opposite of it, but the words don't match the images. This is like, this AOC thing recently, where clearly that's like a scene out of the Hunger Games.
Yes.
Where, it's like a joke where this super rich person with her, with masks being, go ahead.
At a gala of all things. She's at a gala, the Met Gala or something.
It's something where Blaine Greenwald had a great article on this, where it's not that champagne socialism is an exception; it's the only kind.
Yes.
Rob K. Henderson has a great article on this where he talks about luxury beliefs, and he basically talks about how many of these things are beliefs that only an economic or cultural elite could propound, because it's almost like the peacock's tail. It's this big, costly signaling thing that you can carry around because you're so alpha that you can tolerate the weight of that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And
costly signaling theory, 100%.
Yeah. Like one example of this is many, many, many people who will, not just tolerate, but promote non-traditional family arrangements are themselves ultra conservative in their personal life. Like this is one contradiction that Rob K. Henderson points out. Okay. But there's many more like this. Like, it may actually be that the elite can tolerate drugs to a greater extent, for example, than most other people. Like they have, at a minimum, greater societal resources to fall back on. If they just do too much, well, someone can put them in rehab. Their friends will talk them out of it. They won't overcorrect and run off the rails, right? Daniel Henninger made this case, many decades ago, this concept of no guardrails, okay? That was basically where society was removing guardrails. Now, the issue is that in many ways, decentralization is removing those guardrails. That is to say, when you remove that centralizing force, it mediates, it moderates, it's a middleman, it's mediocre. I mentioned this on the Ferris podcast, but each of those are words that have different connotations, but they're all kind of the same thing, where there's a centralizing force that is keeping things stable, is preventing things from getting too good or too bad.
Right.
And so the guardrails are being removed. And so the upside is happening, but the downside is also happening, and people are crashing and they're also rising. I think on balance, in the long term, it's on net good, because the things that are good grow so exponentially that they will absorb and pick up the pieces for the things that are bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's to say, you can only go to zero, but you can get to infinity.
Right.
But I do think that unbundling process, that deguardrailification is happening. Anyway, so what I think happens at the end of that is you rebundle. The goal is not to just maximize an objective. It is to optimize, societal flourishing to societal freedom. Like, what is the vision of crypto civilization? Just to talk about it, so I've used that word a few times: crypto civilization versus crypto anarchy. To me, what is that? That is reversing aging and life extension. That is Mars. That is advancing mathematics. And why do I say mathematics? Because I think of it as a civilizational ruler. Mm-hmm. You can basically compare civilizations by how good they are at math across time and space. If you woke me up in the year 3000 and I was asked to measure what civilizational progress is, I'd ask something like, has the Riemann hypothesis, been solved? Have the Clay math problems been solved?
Right.
Where are we on math?
Yeah, okay. Everything's downstream from that.
Everything's downstream from that, because that is what Homo sapiens is to, I was going to say Neanderthals, but really Neanderthals, we may have interbreeded with them. There's, introgression, if you read the genetics papers. What we were to our precursor, 1,000 years from now, we might be robotic, creatures or some descendant of us that we can't even imagine at this point.
Yes.
And we'd be as different from the current human would be as different from that as we are from our hominid distant ancestors. Okay. Right. That's very possible. In that case, how do you measure progress? I think it's going to be mathematics. I think that's going to be the ruler. Now, there's going to be a lot of people who will be really mad or disagree with that. And that actually is a very important axis. I kind of think that despite how dispositionally against just straight maximization I am, I think the future axis of the world is transhumanism versus anarcho-primitivism.
The second one's anarcho-primitives.
Have you heard that term?
I have not.
So essentially, I feel like our current, political axis is rotating such that this is eventually the main event. Transhumanism versus anarcho-primitivism. And what anarcho-primitivism is basically like the Unabomber style ideology. Okay. It is, and there's also extreme climate activists who believe in this type of stuff, which is humans are a mistake, industrial civilization's a mistake. We need to go back to green. There's something called this is a caricature, but I don't think it'll be one eventually. Like vehement voluntary human extinction movement for a while back is kind of a joke, but kind of not.
Yeah, it's like ecological nihilism or something.
Yeah, it's something which sort of says humans are bad, their impact on the world is bad, more humans are bad, civilization is bad, technological development is bad. And I think you're going to see more and more of this, especially in the West, as technology destabilizes the society they knew. There'll be an anti-tech reaction. And, Jordan Peterson, you mentioned him before, he's actually pointed out that there are several revolutions going on at the same time right now. For example, Tinder and Hinge and these other dating apps where you just swipe left and swipe right. If you've seen the graph of how people meet their partners, okay, have you seen that graph?
Yeah, it's like 80+% on these apps now.
Yes, it's all internet. It's like internet and everything else. People used to meet through their church. They used to meet through bars, family, friends, workplace. Yeah, the only thing that's up besides the internet is like bars.
Oh, I thought, interesting.
Okay. And that might change too post-COVID because, it's like difficult to just go out, right? Yeah. So essentially, it's just all internet mating. It's all just, swipe left. That's a radical change from whatever 100 years of human history, where your community had some de facto influence in who you mated with, whether it was like, okay, well, you had respect for marrying somebody with the same religious denomination or something like that. Those were huge influences on people. That's become completely unbundled, right?
Yeah.
And that's just like one of these revolutions. And this observation is not original to me. Peterson made it. But if you add up all of those, I can see why people would be against technology, or they feel it's destabilizing, or they feel they can't ride the tiger, or they want to jam it back in the box. And, even though like MAGA and the New York Times, they seem opposed, and they are in many ways. Like, one group wants to return to the 1950s, sort of, and the other group kind of wants to return to pre-2008, before the internet really started kicking their butt on everything. They hate the tech guys, right?
Yeah.
The quote tech bros. And so like, as both of those things start fading into the distant past, even like guys like Krugman, for example, Paul Krugman, he also kind of romanticizes like the 50s, but from a different era of, it was a strong centralized state and it was in control and so on. So people had this sort of hazy image of the past that they're romanticizing. And as the reasons for that, like, as 2008 and 1950 become closer and closer to each other, the past they're romanticizing becomes closer, and they hate the future more and more. By contrast, in Asia, they like the future on balance. Because the 20th century sucked for them. This is not something that like an American feels viscerally, because, or like most Americans, because obviously there's Americans who are immigrants and have this experience from overseas. But the American experience of the 50s is sort of civilizational memory that's been documented in movies, and it becomes more romanticized in some ways the further back it goes. Even the 90s were a very good era, for the US, where it's prosperity. And in the 50s, like a guy with a high school degree could provide for a whole family, and they could have a house and a car and all this stuff. And the thing about that is that time and place was actually very aberrant, because in the 50s, the rest of the world had been bombed to smithereens.
Right.
Or was in the middle of civil war or communism, right? Like Russia had just lost, the Soviet Union was under communism and lost like 20 million people. Germany was ruined. Britain had lost, like it had been bombed during the Battle of Britain and lost whatever 100,000 men. China was in the middle of civil war. Japan had been nuked and occupied, blah, blah, blah. You go around the world and all of these industrial centers had been bombed or hit by communism or socialism or both, right? And so the factories of the world were shut off, and the US was the least badly hit. It only lost, quote unquote, only on the order of like 300,000 men, I believe, and the homeland, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, was mostly intact. So it was the best off after World War II, and a lot of its competition had just been hit. So it was inevitable that as the rest of the world uninstalled that Western mind virus, and the reason I call it Western is it originated from the West, of socialism and communism, as it uninstalled that Western mind virus, as it didn't just throw off colonialism and go to the economic left, but eventually came back to the economic right, or libertarian right, with both Deng Xiaoping and WiM116 in 1970 and 1991, respectively, throwing off communism and socialism in China and India. As it did that, it was inevitable that that would grow, and that would become a larger piece of the world, and that would bring on competition and it'd build products, because there's smart people overseas. And so the thing is that in Asia, they don't romanticize that past at all.
Right.
Beyond, well, actually, I shouldn't say at all. They do in China romanticize Mao kicking out the foreigners. That's the big thing. Like Mao in China is, obviously is a genocidal maniac that killed millions of Chinese people. Okay.
Yes.
But because he won, and because the Chinese Communist Party has an interest in portraying itself as a continuous entity, because Deng Xiaoping, basically what he did was like a coup in 1978. The way he took over China. Very few Americans know about this. Should I talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, please. I don't know the history of it.
Okay, so the thing is that, like, how did China get rich? It was this desperately poor communist country that somehow managed to like level up to such an extent that it's contending with the US. And like this, the simple, and I'd say kind of, it's one piece of it, but like sort of the dumb explanation is, we outsource all the jobs there. That's a piece of it. Okay. But why did they go there? Like how did they execute? They obviously executed. They built up their cities. They built up their navy. They built up their IT. Like clearly they executed as well as being the beneficiaries of some of the outsourcing or whatever. Right. And what happened specifically? So to make a very long story short, after World War II, the nationalists and the communists who had fought together against the Japanese occupation, had a truce, they resumed fighting. So Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, the communists and nationalists, resumed fighting. Mao eventually won, basically because, there's a whole thing on who lost China. And there's an argument to be made that guys like Owen Lattimore and Edgar Snow was this journalist from a few decades earlier who had written these hagiographies of Mao. By the way, many of these communist dictators, some great people to Google. John Reed, he's buried in the Soviet Union. He wrote the account of Russia's revolution, 10 Days That Shook the World. He's buried near Lenin because he's so holy in the Soviet Union. He's this journalist that glorified them. Edgar Snow glorified Mao. Walter Duranty glorified Stalin and the Ukrainian famine. And Herbert Matthews was responsible for Castro taking over Cuba. So many of these things were actually Western impositions. And when you drill into what happened in China, Mao basically was able to beat Chiang Kai-shek because guys like Owen Lattimore in the State Department pulled support. And this is controversial. There's books on it at the time, like Who Lost China or what have you. But it's a little bit like, if you think about the Israelis and Palestinians today, Republicans back, roughly the Israelis, Democrats roughly back the Palestinians. You can argue it's not completely polarized that way, but it's kind of like that. And sort of in the same way, Republicans backed the nationalists and Democrats were not exactly pro-communist, but there were many that were anti-communist. And so they didn't think that Mao was going to be that bad. They were influenced by Edgar Snow's book, like Red Star Over China. Guys like Owen Lattimore were sympathetic to it. They thought it was anti-colonialism for real and be okay. Net is the US did not back hard enough. Nationalists were driven to Taiwan. The communists won. And then Mao began consolidating power. And there's obviously many other things that happened, the Korean War, et cetera. But what would happen over the next 30-something years is that the Great Leap Forward happened, where agriculture was collectivized, millions of Chinese people died, and the Cultural Revolution happened from 66 to 76, where it's basically like wokeness. Everybody is denouncing everybody. The professors were sent to the fields, and the students were encouraged to kill the professors. Literally kill. To get a sense of it, you know how crazy college campuses are in the US nowadays?
Well, I know how crazy they were from 2004 to 2008.
Okay, fine. But they're crazier today. However, the level of craziness they got to in China during the Communist Revolution or during the Cultural Revolution was, during that period, kids at Tsinghua were, which is like the Chinese MIT, were grouping into factions and machine gunning each other on campus.
My God. Wow.
Okay, that was what China was like over that period. Just total insane communist anarchy. It was Maoist. It was
what period was this?
66 to 76.
Wow.
Actually, if you want flavor of what happened there, there's this great book. This is a famous book, but the Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu. Okay. Famous, basically maybe the most famous Chinese author right now. Read just the first chapter of the first book. And even though it's fictionalized, it'll give you a sense of how insane China was under communism. It's just simply not, for many reasons, it hasn't been documented in movies. And part of that is that China itself kind of wants to kind of whitewash that history. Yeah, that was in the past. Let's forget about it, whatever, right? And there's a lot of Americans who are quasi-sympathetic or even outright sympathetic to communism and think, oh, it had good intentions. Nazism is really evil. Okay. And so the media on this has not actually been made, but there's an opportunity to show what it actually was. By the way, if anybody wants to, that's the kind of thing I'd love to fund, to put some Bitcoin in somebody doing that. Okay. Just showing what the history of communism actually was, because you have no shortage of drama. You have the Berlin airlift, and you have the Cultural Revolution, and you have the Great Leap Forward, and you have the 100 Flowers campaign, in the Eastern theater and the Western theater. Berlin airlift is happening in Europe, the 100 Flowers in China. All this stuff is happening. And it's incredibly dramatic, and you can just take it out of a Wikipedia article or a Britannic article, whatever, and turn it into a script. And it's just down the middle. You don't even have to make it up. It's just, you wouldn't have to fictionalize it. Yeah. But okay, coming back to the stack. So net is this insane communist state was killing people, pitting people against each other. By the mid 70s, there's enough folks who had enough, but obviously there's no election or any way for them to voice it. Deng Xiaoping had been purged multiple times in China. Today, we would call that canceled. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Under communism, purging typically meant you lost your life, liberty, and or property. That is, you were shot, jailed, and or robbed. Okay. But Deng managed to kind of duck and like kind of avoid it, where he was purged, but he was so competent that like they didn't actually kill him. He had enough sympathizers that he could like hang on to the margins of society. And he made his way back. In the chaos after Mao's death, he essentially managed to get enough of the military guys and so on his side that he outmaneuvered the so-called Gang of Four and managed to take control of China around 1978. And most people were okay with him taking control because they thought, among other things, that he was very old. And so he wasn't going to be able to make it. He was in the 70s when he took total control of China. But the guy was so competent that for the next 14 odd years, he managed to run China. And like he ran a turnaround of a communist state where there's probably countless people who wanted to assassinate him. And he managed to turn it into this capitalist machine, make peace with the West, and lay the foundation. It's actually like really kind of insane, level of turnaround. Like Ezra Vogel has a good book on this. Now, Deng did other things. Deng did Tiananmen. And so he fired on the group of people who was protesting. And so that's why a lot of people dislike him. And I can understand that.
Let me ask one question here. Was part of this, because I've heard Peterson talk about this, that China opened up, I think this started in agriculture actually, that they were having food shortages from the communistic model. So they actually opened up agriculture to competition. And so they started adding these capitalistic elements under the communistic state. Is that what enabled them to become the production factory of the world effectively?
That's part of it. There's actually a good, like, kind of quick article on this called The Secret Document That Transformed China. Actually, it's from NPR of all places in 2011, before they went as woke as they are. But essentially, there's a village in Zhaogang where some folks there were, under communism, you didn't own anything. You didn't even own the teeth in your head. And so the thing that they gathered in hushed whispers to talk about is, hey, can we sign a contract between us where we all agree that, we'll produce food, but we get to keep some of it for ourselves? Okay. Because rather than 100%, like this was something, to give a sense, this was so controversial at that time that they signed the contract. And do you know what the key term of the contract was? That if they were killed for practicing capitalism, that some of the other people in the village would take care of their children.
Wow.
Okay. So entrepreneurship was punishable by death.
Yeah.
In living memory, that's like 1978. That's only, that's like 44 years ago. That's not that long ago.
Wow.
Okay. So what a difference from the modern China, where you have all of these companies and whatnot, right? It's turning more communist in a way now, but there's a 40-year period. So yes, so that was an example of I think what Peterson is referring to, where these guys, by the way, what happened was they had a bumper harvest. And because they had a bumper harvest, they came under suspicion from the state, who got really curious as to why these guys were able to, grow so much crop when everyone else was. And they suspected them of practicing capitalism. They were going to round them all up and execute them, which is the rewards you get for starting a business. Tax the rich, right? The communist style, right? Kill the rich, basically eat the rich, right? And this is, of course, relatively rich. It's like some poor peasant who has, like a little more green.
Reducing your effective tax rate from 100% to 98, right? And that's the rich in China.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So what happened was, fortunately for them, and unfortunately for all the people who pursued them, but fortunately for them, Deng was in power then and basically held up a hand and said, hey, actually, you know what? Let's not kill them. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
And so he didn't try to flip the entire country from communist to capitalist. Instead, he set up these so-called special economic zones, of which Shenzhen was the first, across the causeway from Hong Kong. And he literally fenced it off So you couldn't like go into Shenzhen, and so this sort of contained it. And so he husbanded his political capital and spent it there. And this way, all the communist lunatics who had been raised for 30 years to just mindlessly spout slogans, they weren't exactly Asawaj, but they couldn't attack it as hard because most of the country was still communist. You just can't flip something into reverse all the way.
Right.
That's something that's that big. So from the success there, because that, of course, grew like a weed, because he had seen, by the way, that Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore were doing so well. He knew the Chinese people could execute. These were like essentially the same ethnic group that was separated, and you brand the experiment. The experiment was communism doesn't work. And
Hong Kong in particular was the Hong Kong miracle, right? It was basically completely flat broke. I think it was even devastated post-conflict at some point, and then they just...
Well, Singapore, I knew, came from third world to first. The Hong Kong miracle, actually, I'm not as familiar with that. So when the
gist of it, I don't know. You'll have to check me on the timeline, but they went from very poor to
after the occupation in 1945.
Yes. Yeah, because the government took a very lax approach, very low and predictable taxes and low intervention.
Yes, that's right. British managed, and it was that's right. Yeah. So essentially, though, basically what Deng was able to do is he couldn't really take advice from Taiwan because that was their historical enemy. He took, and Hong Kong was the British, and but Singapore was an independent state, and Lee Kuan Yew mentored Deng Xiaoping and basically like CEO to CEO, kind of taught him capitalism and was responsible for kind of, because it's actually insane that this guy at 78, after 2 generations of communist brainwashing, with the entire country dirt poor, it's like taking somebody who is a religious fundamentalist who literally fought a holy war to start the state, and then teaching them astronomy and really complicated math at age 78, and then having them pull off like a moon landing. It's kind of at that level of difficulty. Okay. Yeah. And as I get older, I'm like, wow, that's actually pretty difficult, right? Yeah. And point is that Deng rolled out capitalism first to Shenzhen and then to the other 4 cities on the eastern seaboard, and then overall reformed the country. And as I said, the main the thing about that is the Chinese did execute. Like they did build up their country. And it's something where then in 1991, after the collapse of the USSR, the Indians also went from socialism to capitalism. Manmohan Singh put in a bunch. They were forced to by the economic crisis that kind of ensued in the 1991 environment. And they basically, that's called liberalization in India. Okay. Mm-hmm. And they also kind of deregulated big chunks of the economy, went away from the license Raj, opened it up. And that's basically the Indian growth story of the last 30 years, which has, issues with it, but it's like way better. India is far, 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 far better than it was when I was a kid. And so my overall point, my macro point here is that India and China have a completely different memory of the 20th century than the West does. They look at it as this time of humiliation, colonialism, poverty, communism or socialism, when they were condescended to. India's not on the UN Security Council. China was they weren't fully colonized, but they were partially colonized with the Opium Wars and so on. Like literally, the U.S. fought to export drugs to China. Right. Do you know about that? That's a. Go ahead.
At the margins, I don't know a lot about it, but I've heard some about it.
Yeah. The thing, that's a huge deal for them. Like that's something that they read novels about. That's like an offense that they pay a lot of attention to. It's one of these interesting things where it's very asymmetric, and this is what propaganda is often. Propaganda is about stressing those true facts that harm the other guy, and that like kind of a clean win for your side, but they don't talk about the complexity. So when Westerners will talk about China, the one event that most Westerners know about is Tiananmen in 1991. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can talk about that. That's a whole thing. But what they don't know about is the Great Leap Forward, or the Cultural Revolution, or Owen Lattimore, or Edgar Snow, or the export of communism to China, or the Opium Wars, which are a huge thing for China, where they are like really mad about Western colonialism.